I wonder, you had this extra room. Why not just sublet it out long term to a roommate?
Because I was 30 and I had just bought my first place and I wanted to have free time in my space when I wanted. I didn't want to always share a place. And to be honest, you've got to be a little bit nicer to roommates. You know what I mean? If someone's staying with you in Airbnb, you don't really have to interact with them if you don't want to. So that'd be the answer to why.
Okay, that makes sense. If you just want a week or 2 or 3 to decompress yourself, have your own personal time, you've got the whole place to yourself because you've just closed off the Airbnb availability. From a financial standpoint, did that come into the equation when you were looking at what I can get for my Airbnb versus what I could collect from rent from a roommate? Or was that not a part of that picture at all? Or was the Airbnb potentially better than having someone there full time?
So taking one step back, when I first started, my intention was to sometimes rent it out with me staying there and sometimes renting out the entire place. And maybe the platform's changed, but at that time, the platform wasn't set up to do that. So I actually set up 2 separate profiles. In terms of like the equation of how I decided to do Airbnb over a roommate, I'm sure I did some kind of basic math like that. But to be honest, when I first moved into my place, like the neighborhood's always been fine, but it wasn't like popping where I could get a huge rent. And Airbnb was blowing up. Before the pandemic, I had several friends all buy like a bunch of extra places. They all bought like an extra place and started like Airbnb. Like it became really hot. Like I got in just at that right time where like people knew about Airbnb and were really using it. So there was a good business volume coming in, but there wasn't necessarily like a lot of competition. When I first started, you could put in very little effort, have a junky room, still live in the place that you're renting out, like just rent out a single room, and you'd still make decent money. I rent out my place now and I make as much now, or maybe even a little less, renting out just my single room than all the way back then when I was renting out. It was junky as heck. Like a stained comforter, like blinds that just had a tension run that were probably hanging at an angle. It was bare bones. And I was a smelly 30-year-old guy. I'm still impressed how much money I made. So yes, that was part of the equation, but especially since I knew that sometimes I would be renting out the entire place, I knew I could make so much more because you can rent out a room for, let's say, $700 to $1,000 in Chicago. Like in the area that I'm in, you could rent it out for roughly that range.
700 to over what time period?
Yeah, so that'd be that's for an actual roommate, not Airbnb, but just you'd make $700 to $1,000 for a roommate in 1 month, and then you could still charge them utilities on top of that. But for Airbnb, for one weekend, I could easily have made like 500. And if it's a festival weekend where places to stay were real tight, for Lollapalooza, it's a big music festival here, I know I made $1,500 in one weekend. I think maybe it was closer to $2,000, $1,700 over 2 or 3 days. And I think one year I might have done $2,000 even. It was crazy.
So it's not even close in that regard. Over a few days, you can make 2-3 times as much as you'd collect from rent from someone being there all the time. That seems pretty easy. And then the flexibility on top of that.